Hi, I'm Jeremy Toeman, and today on Founder at 50, my guest is Michael Stern. He invests across public and private markets with a strong focus on environmental and social responsibility. Michael's journey is anything but ordinary, from handwriting code in Los Alamos as a teenager, to joining D.E. Shaw in its early days, to identifying and bringing a case to the SEC. In this episode, Michael shares the lessons of his early startup failures and how being Jeff Bezos adjacent wasn't really a leg up, and reflects on what it really means to invest with purpose. He shares great stories about the companies he backs, like a VR firm supporting police de-escalation and a startup making highway crash sensors that truly save lives, and why story-driven investing is more than just a feel-good philosophy. Throughout our conversation, Michael reflects on the value of doing work you're truly proud of, why moral clarity beats ROI, and how making it look easy can be a powerful edge, both in cycling and in life. Michael's also given me great advice during my time running Augie, and I'm so glad to have him here on the podcast today. Michael, how are you today?
Doing well. It's great to see you. Great to talk with you.
It's great to see you too. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you giving me some of your time.
I'm looking forward to it. This is the first time I have recorded a podcast. Lord knows I listen to a lot of them.
Well, I have a hunch we're going to have a fun conversation. And what I like to do is talk through sort of the journey and the arcs. And if you wouldn't mind, give us a quick snapshot of like how you define where you are in your career today. And then we're going to zoom way back in time and figure out how you got here and what were some of the interesting journeys along the way.
Sure. So I'm a managing director at an investment firm called Kintegral Asset Management. This is an environmentally and socially responsible asset manager. It was created originally to meet the demands of a single family, though we do more than that now. We invest in public and private markets. We invest directly and via outside managers in all asset classes. This includes investing in socially and environmentally worthy startups, and that's one of my duties. I'm particularly fond of companies that have dual use technologies. Companies that make things that are of use both in the private sector and to the government. And I can give examples of some of those if you like.
Very
But
interesting.
that's what I do now. And not just that, but lots of things at this firm, including that.
Awesome. And now we're going to go way back machine right away. Let's go to early 20s. Little Michael coming out of school. Tell us about where you landed right out of school. And I want to get us to about 23, 25-year-old.
I'm even going to go a little bit farther back than that.
Great.
In my late teens, I was very much an inorganic chemistry person, and especially at the intersection of inorganic chemistry and chemical kinetics with computer programming and the early days of creating computer software for modeling the kinetics of chemical reactions, which I did academically and I did for the government. I was actually on staff at Los Alamos National Laboratory, technically for 2 years, although I was also in school, so I was only there during school breaks. And then when I graduated college, wasn't in a position to do grad school, really wanted to move to New York City, discovered to my surprise and delight that there were people who were willing to pay me to be in New York City.
Wait, so before New York, where were you based?
I was going to school in Massachusetts and obviously spending a lot of time in New Mexico.
Okay. And what was the draw to New York? What happened?
I don't know that I have a clear answer for that at this point. It was just really obvious to me that to be a complete person in late 20th century America, you should spend some time in New York. And at that time, I thought it was going to be a year or two. I thought, like, somebody crazy enough to pay me money to, like, be in New York, like, yeah, I'll do that for a couple of years and then I'll get on with my life. And, it's 35 years later and
I get that pull, by the way. When I graduated college, I had done a 6-month internship in San Francisco, and I graduated college. I was working in Pittsburgh for about a couple of years, and I had a business trip out there. I had some clients to go visit. I don't even remember the details, but I remember that drive from SFO into the city, and you come around South San Francisco, and I had this like, oh my God, I have to live here. Like, obviously I went into the tech scene, but I get that pull where there's just something calling you.
Yeah.
Okay, so you do land in New York, and what were you doing right off the bat?
Well, when my initial mission, of course, was just to be in the city. And so I applied for all kinds of stuff, right? It wasn't like nowadays, like undergraduate college tends to be very pre-professional, right? So kids know, certainly by their sophomore year, like well, if I want to go into finance, I have to start lining up my internships. I have to take all the right classes. I have to get into the investment club. And the investment club, of course, the gatekeepers are undergraduates. So I have to make friends with those undergraduates because otherwise they won't let me into the investment club and I won't get the interviews I want. Like, dear God, kid, just like study calligraphy or something. Like, take advantage of school and like the ability to do something other than just train for a job. Anyway, I was graduating. I hadn't done, I mean, my school didn't even offer finance classes, certainly wouldn't have taken one if they did. But so I applied for, some consulting stuff, some corporate stuff, applied for a job at one of the early big quantitative hedge funds, a shop called D.E. Shaw and Co. It still exists. They're very good at what they do. And they were a pack of dorks of exactly the same kind of dork that I was at the time. And they're like, yeah, join our pack of dorks. And I was like, that sounds like fun. And I did, and like no regrets. I remain very friendly with lots of people from there. It was a great place to be. Now, I was there for, I'm going to say 4 years, something like that. And then I sort of switched back and forth between finance and startups several times.
Okay. You're in that phase, you're playing with startups, you're playing with finance. Are you one of those, when I'm 20 years from now, I want to be running the show or et cetera? Or were you explore it as your journey, took you?
That's an interesting question. There were definitely times where there were things that I wanted to accomplish. But most of the time, when I'm in finance, when I'm working for these larger firms, I'm a member of a team.
Right.
And whatever my particular passion might be has to be subordinate to the needs of the larger organization. And if you can't do that, if you can't accomplish that, you're in the wrong place.
So when you think about some of those goals, though, I like to talk through this theme of, sort of expectations versus reality. Do you remember any of those goals? How'd you do on them? Are there a couple that were so important and you've hit them? Were there any that you came to realize didn't really need to do that one?
The truth is that a lot of them would sound very dated, and some of them were so specific to a particular moment in time that I can tell them only as comical anecdotes. So, for example, in the late 1990s, my first startup, which was a marketplace, it's not even worth going into the details. It didn't really go anywhere. But part of the reason why I founded it, and like a lot of people from D.E. Shaw were founding startups at that same time. And the reason's very simple. We'd all worked with Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos had been at D.E. Shaw before he founded Amazon. Jeff Bezos lost money just about every day that he worked at D.E. Shaw. And we all looked at that and we said, wait, if he can found this online bookstore that's making him rich and famous, and like he lost money for Shaw, like day after day after day, we must be able to do better than Jeff Bezos. And so many of us went out and founded companies that, to be absolutely clear for your listeners, were not more successful than Jeff Bezos.
So thinking about that, though, as a model, if you were to sort of translate it today, I think it's a very viable model. It's the, you see an emblem of success effectively, especially one you've had direct connection with. So there's people out there right now maybe working at one of, for example, Elon Musk's companies, and we're not going to talk about this politically, or anybody else out there. In fact, you could still use Bezos if you want. What advice would you give to someone today on that kind of a model?
I certainly wouldn't say that nobody should have done it, right? I mean, there were people who absolutely found their passions. There were people who, even if the startup that they created in 1997 or 1998 didn't turn out to be successful, it started them on an interesting path, introduced them to interesting people, helped them develop skills that they wouldn't otherwise have developed. Those are valuable things. That said, off the top of my head, with the exception of Amazon, I don't think any of those companies made it. There were about certainly 10 of them, maybe more. A lot of us went out and did these things.
You're imbued with the startup spirit and you're in your 20s and it's a great time to do startups. I'm curious, were you in .com as it occurred?
We had a technology, it was a marketplace technology, as I said, and we had some interesting customers, which the most important at the time, and remember I said a lot of these anecdotes are like super dated to the point that they're only useful for comedy purposes, but our largest investor and most important partner was AOL.
Okay.
Which made us at the time terrifying to our competitors. There were a couple of other companies that maybe had raised more money than we were, but people took us super seriously because we had the AOL money.
Right.
And AOL was troubled, right? They had done the Time Warner deal after they invested in us, but they were still, a big player, significant. On the strength of that, we were sort of building out, landing more customers. Revenue was negligible. The product was not in that form useful. And we watched people pivoting, right? We never really found product market fit. And we watched, that term didn't even exist at the time. But
No,
if it had, we wouldn't have found it. We watched our competitors handling sort of pivoting. Everybody was pivoting. The major pivot, which like several of them did and ended up merging together after they pivoted, was becoming, I'll just say, porn-related enterprises. Like the technology was useful for particular kinds of pornography and they went for it. And I remember giving a presentation to my board. I was like, look, this seems to be the thing that people are making work, right? They're finding, someday people will use the term product market fit to describe what these other companies are doing. And I can see it, and I know we can do that with our technology too, but I'll let y'all vote on it. And if you decide you want to do it, that's fine, but I will step down because I can't do that with my life. Yeah. And they said, no, we'd rather just lose our money. I said, spot on, because that's what's going to happen, right? Because, people smarter than us had like positioned better, and didn't have to make that tough decision. But where we were at that time, that was the only thing that people like us were making work.
Let me ask you, Michael, did you find it difficult as an entrepreneur to have to make effectively, I don't want to get too heavy-handed with the term, but like a moralistic decision over a profitable or ROI style decision?
I didn't have to spend 1 second thinking about that because I was relatively young and like there was no way that I wanted the rest of my life to be, whether it was successful or failure. Like I was the guy who had a successful or unsuccessful porn company in the early 2000s. Like that, it's not a sentence I ever wanted to have to say.
Okay, so what happened next? The 2000s hit.
Final decision to shut the company down happened after 9/11, right? We kept the company sort of limping along until after 9/11, but our offices were down by the World Trade Center. We lost access to the offices for a while. One of our investors, lost family, and just like the whole vibe changed. So we shut the company down pretty quickly. The technology still exists out there in the world in that my CTO, who's a great guy, basically had the code base and went out and launched a consulting company in which he was selling versions of our core technology to enterprises. And I've heard from people who said, oh, yeah, I saw your tech like running at Altria or like whatever. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm glad somebody's getting value out of it. And I took a year off, something like that.
Okay.
Year and a half, climbed mountains, up to and including Mount McKinley, summited Mount McKinley. Yeah. 22 days up, 21 hours down.
My goodness. That's a hike.
Yeah, that was a hike. But lots of other climbing and, did some traveling, did some trekking in New Zealand. No complaints, would recommend it to anybody. And then came back and went back into finance, back to at that point a shop called HBK Investment, just another multi-strategy hedge fund. Great people worked there, had a great time, worked on some fun, crazy stuff involving especially the insurance market. And yeah, that was back in finance.
When you were faced with that moment, you're coming back from the trekking, etc., did you consider starting something else on your own?
I did not have a vision for another startup, and doing a startup just because you think you want to have a startup is a strange decision. I do know people who have done that. I mean, I have one guy in particular in mind who he wanted to be a founder, didn't have a great idea, but like he wanted to be into the culture. He wanted I can't say the lifestyle. Like if you're doing it right, the lifestyle's miserable. So you don't do it for the lifestyle.
Yeah, I don't know why you would do this for the lifestyle. By the way, I love your statement there because I too was faced with a similar thing. In fact, when I left Sling, at the time it was called Sling Media, it's now the Sling TV product. When I left, I had the VC literally say, I'll give you $500,000 to start anything you want. And by the way, this is in my, I probably should have done that. I don't know what I might have done, but much like you, I'm one of those, if I don't have a vision, I don't know what to do with myself. And I don't know how to spend someone else's money without that vision. So, but I get it. It's a different type, right? It's not, it's, as a friend of mine said, it's like chocolate and vanilla, just a different way your mind works kind of thing.
Right. So anyway, I was back on finance and working on fun stuff.
Were you trying to learn? Were you just trying to make money? Were you trying to network, or just taking the journey as it unfolded?
Those were busy days, right? So I'd come back from a year of mountain climbing, met the woman I was going to marry pretty quickly after I came back, started having kids pretty quickly, was lucky enough to have bought a bunch of Apple stock at the very bottom, not the very bottom, but it was the day that Steve Jobs introduced the original iMac, the original gumdrops shaped iMac.
The color ones?
Yes. Well, the original one was just blue. They weren't multicolored yet.
Okay.
Bondi blue. And I remember like emailing my mom and saying, you should buy some Apple stock today. And then I bought some too. And so that was the down payment on my first house.
You said that wasn't at the very bottom, which I think was 6, if I'm not mistaken. How close to the bottom did you get?
Well, there was a later like 12-to-1 split. So it was around 10 maybe.
Mazel tov, my friend. That's wonderful.
But I don't still own those shares, right? I sold those shares and that was the down payment on my first house. So like there was a lot going on, right? Like having kids,
Right.
buying house, whatever. And I was, working on stuff I enjoyed working on with people I enjoyed working with, and stayed there until basically somebody showed up and said, like, we'd really like you to take a job doing something slightly different somewhere else. So did that, let myself get headhunted.
When would you say you sort of reached that next stage of the arc? So when did that become something different? Was there a moment where you wanted it changed or personalized kind of investing work? What was there, again, what pushed you through that journey?
Do people really have distinct chapters like that? I don't know that I ever have.
I don't think there's no rule. All I've learned in a few episodes of doing this is that some people definitively think of their life in phases, and some people are just sort of marching along day by. I'm a day by day kind of guy, but definitely that's not always true.
Yeah, honestly, worked for several great places in finance, worked on some interesting projects. One of the things that I particularly enjoyed at the shop I worked for after HBK is that for the first time, I found a company, a publicly traded company that I identified as being a fraud. We put on a massive short bet against this company as a fraction of capital under management, the largest trade I've ever done, so far beyond what anybody would tell you is responsible. And then we ratted them out to the authorities and we blew up that company, and that was fun. They were bad people and we ended them. They were stealing from people and we ended it. And that, I enjoyed that.
That sounds like it must have hit satisfying at so many levels. Being able to take down the bad guys and do something profitable for the company you work at and be like a leader in that. I'm guessing that was at least satisfying.
And you're missing what was also very important, which was getting a story out of it. Like, I make choices sometimes in order to get the story. And this was something where there was, like a crazy story behind it. The initial phone, did the work. The work was absolutely compelling. There was no question these people were crooks. And I don't need to say alleged crooks because they were ultimately convicted. So these were full-on
you get
Wikipedia
to say
certifiable crooks. Once we convinced ourselves they were crooks, we spoke with lawyers and we were like, okay, how do we deal with this? Because you don't want to say something that you could get in trouble saying. You don't want to make yourself the target of a lawsuit. You do want to take action. And lawyers are like, well, you want to step it up gradually. So this first thing first, call their auditors. So call their auditors, PwC, and you send a memo, like very long memo explaining all the stuff these guys were doing. And the auditor said, okay, we're going to set up a call. It's going to be you. It's going to be the head of our Southwest region. This company was based in Texas. And, We'll have one of our associate general counsels on the call and walk us through this stuff. And the head of the Southwest region asked substantially just one question. And just to be clear, this company was a fraud. These people were criminals. I can say that because they were convicted. So I had this document that explained how they were all criminals and they were probably all going to go to jail. And PwC had one question, which was, is there any possible explanation for what's going on here other than fraud? And my answer was, yeah, they could be so incompetent that their behavior is indistinguishable from fraud. He said, great, that's all I need to know. They will stay a loyal customer to us.
Wow.
Yeah. PwC,
wow.
Good work. PwC fired them later when the Wells notices came down, fired them as a customer later when the Wells notices came down. But, whatever, it's a story. It's a story. There's also the story when I went to their annual meetings, or publicly traded companies, annual meetings. I bought one share of stock so I could go to the annual meeting, even though we were short many, many, many more shares than that in the corporate account. And I basically got a threat from the president of the company, and the CEO of the company collected weapons. He claimed to be a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and he had a rifle collection. I was like, do I really want to be going to this meeting with these people? And whatever. It's all stories.
Do you think that if someone were given all the details, they could turn it into a pretty good movie version? Could you up the drama a little bit? Could you get the helicopter and guns guy up a little?
I mean,
yeah, you could turn I mean, he didn't actually try and kill me, so that the
Of
story
course.
like becomes less exciting with armed with that. But there was all kinds of crazy stuff. There was like later turned out that some of the money that was being stolen, a small fraction, the CEO was funneling to a woman who was almost certainly his mistress, who was running an animal rescue thing in like Plano, Texas. And so he was funneling like hundreds of thousands of dollars to this animal rescue company in order to support the woman who was probably his girlfriend. It was like crazy stuff going on.
And we're going to put a pin in the story, but were you actually the person who found the first, like, hey, wait a sec, something's not adding up here? What did some analyst bring you a thing? Like, what was that first nugget of something's wrong here?
The company was operating in a space that I knew very well. I knew how much money one should be able to make doing the kinds of transactions that they were doing. In this regard, it's actually not dissimilar from Harry Markopolos and the Bernie Madoff fraud. Harry Markopolos was charged at replicating what Bernie Madoff was doing, and he came out of that effort saying he's making too much money.
It's the too good to be true moment.
I knew how much money it should have been possible to make doing what these people were doing, and they were making too much, too consistently, way too much, way too consistently. And that was where it started. But, then to actually prove it was a fraud, what they were doing, I don't want to give too many details unless you want them, I suppose. They were raising money from retailish investors, especially retirees, and using that money to buy some insurance-related assets. These insurance-related assets were trading in a marketplace, so any sophisticated investor could be shown these assets and bid on them. But then this firm, armed with the money from these retirees, were bidding against you. And essentially any one of these assets that they wanted to buy, they would get because they could pay anything for it because they were lying to their investors about what they were getting. When they did this, because the assets that they were buying had been shown to the market, it was possible for me to, A, call the company, like didn't know me at that point, and pretend I was an interested investor and say, send me information about all these assets you're buying. And then go to the regular market and see the same assets as they were trading around among sophisticated investors. And I could compare how they were describing the assets to the old people and what the assets actually were. And that then enabled me to make a very powerful case, a case that the SEC and the FBI found very useful.
Interesting. Okay. So when was this? Are we roughly what?
I mean, 2010, maybe that trade.
Got it. So take us a little bit from that part of your journey into the, where I know you on the private fund investing side of things. What were some of the major steps there? I'd love to hear those moments.
Well, probably the next interesting chapter was that I ran, this is another startup, this is technically my third startup, a shop called Empowerment Capital. And Empowerment Capital was investing in startups, exclusively using non-equity investments. So structured credit. In particular, we were doing revenue share investing. And I had a small group of wealthy investors who backed this effort, and it was a lot of trying to find companies that were worth investing in. At that point, we had a mandate that was not as strong as the mandate we have now at Kintegral. Kintegral companies, we apply a pretty strict social environmental test, a series of tests before we'll invest in them. We try to be very sophisticated here about how we think about greenwashing. Because if people hear that you have constraints, they'll adjust their pitch so that it creates the illusion of complying with your mandate, even if it doesn't.
Sure.
At Empowerment Capital, we weren't quite as strict, so we would invest. We really liked companies that were environmentally and socially responsible, but there were other companies we just viewed as neutral. Given that we were based in New York City, there are certain sort of town industries in New York, marketing, real estate. If you're giving money to startups in New York City, you're going to see a lot of marketing technology. You're going to see a lot of real estate related technology. And we would look at those. In the course of doing that work, I came across a really interesting company. I actually met them at the Columbia University Startups Contest. I was a judge of the contest. I didn't go to Columbia, but I was Columbia adjacent and was invited to be a judge of the contest. And in this case, they were backdrop to one company that sounded great. And so I submitted my scores to the contest, and then I called the CEO and said, dude, we got to talk.
Okay.
And that was a company called Street Smarts VR. And it was founded by a young woman who came from like a VR, AR background, and a young man who had an Ivy League education, but had then gone to the Marine Corps, had served in the Marine Corps, had become a captain, I think, in the Marine Corps, and then had gone to business school under the GI Bill. And his expertise, together with her expertise, allowed them to create a company that was using VR, creating VR tools for training police officers, specifically training police officers in how to not shoot the people that they're not supposed to shoot. And they had landed incredible customers, and the technology, which I later demoed, is astonishing. If you've ever heard the expression that VR is an empathy machine, wow, is that true? I had never in my life had so much empathy and sympathy for police officers as I did after putting on the helmet and demoing this thing, because the stress, the intensity, the difficulty of the decision making, I couldn't have imagined. And the importance of training and the value of this technology for the training. This company was pretty early in its path. I mean, they had great customers, but in terms of revenue and stuff, they were earlier than we would normally consider investing in. And we put a lot of work in structuring an investment that de-risked the opportunity sufficiently that we were able to put money in. And it went incredibly well. The amount of money that the investment required was a little bit more than my investors could put in. As part of that, I was dialing around friends of mine from D.E. Shaw, from HBK, and said, okay, I need an extra X dollars to complete this investment. Can you do this for me? And one of them said yes. And so they were there. So the investment could happen, right? It couldn't have happened without that additional money. And the investment went very, very well. I continued to back that company and support them. And just last week, I personally put money into their Series A.
Wow.
I remain close with these guys. But the firm that put money in and then had it go very well was essentially the antecedent of Kintegral. And so that then started a discussion of, hey, can you find more companies like this one that are doing things that are socially beneficial, and maybe like scale back or like shut off empowerment capital and just come and do this stuff for us? It's like, well, like these are nice people and they've got a lot of money, and like, let's try it. So yeah, that's how I got here.
And for people who might be a little less familiar, do a favor and define the difference between what a traditional venture capitalist does and what your firm does.
Well, what the firm here does as a whole is way more than venture capital. Venture capital is, and stuff like venture capital, is the tiniest amount of what we do. So probably the largest piece of what we do is public equities investing. Because the core team here comes from D.E. Shaw, which is a quantitative investing firm, it should be no surprise that the core discipline here is very systematic. And so we put together, I can't really take credit for it because the core of this was done before I was anywhere around, but the firm put together a series of algorithms, scoring algorithms, that are applied to thousands of companies. I mean, the top of the funnel for calibrating the system is, 10,000 companies. And then once it's calibrated, it's applied to 6,000 companies, I think, in the US. And it scores these companies on the basis of their environmental and social merit and governance factors. But also the goal is to outperform the market, right? We are not in the business of underperforming. And it works, right? I mean, finance people will know what it means when they say the following words. Net of fees, we generate positive alpha with a portfolio that is selected for environmental and social merit. I don't know if there's anybody else in the world who can say that. That is the largest part of what we do. It is something we have a very large amount of money in, and that is also a component of other things we do because we have certain products that we offer. We combine different pieces, and one of the pieces is typically that. We do other things, but that gives you an idea.
That does. And in your role, do you spend your time spanning some of those other areas, or are you, myopically focused on finding startups, et cetera?
I am not myopically focused on finding startups. There was a time when that was the largest piece of my job. And among other things, I ran an internship program. I've run internship programs for years and always enjoy running the internship program. And the interns come in and we teach them, like, how do you find companies? How do you talk with companies? And like, this was my job. It was like finding companies, talking with founders, working with interns and other people here and helping them find companies, evaluating, structuring deals. Right now, it's maybe the smallest part of my job. I've just got a lot of other stuff I'm working on because this is a big firm. We do a lot of stuff.
And so in that capacity today, is there anything about your job that you find the most personal joy or engagement out of? What's sort of the sprinkles on top in the work you do?
Well, remember I said earlier that I'm very driven by stories, right? Want to generate the stories, want to have the stories. And the startups are better than anything else for that. Because what's the story I can tell you about our public equity portfolio? But then, on the other hand, I can tell you that I have money with a company in California called Pilot, which makes smart versions of dumb things associated with highway safety. Have you ever noticed a crash attenuation device on a highway? So if there's like a pole next to the road, or if the road splits off because there's an off-ramp, and there's something pointing.
The buckets full of water or whatever.
One
right?
common design is a plastic bucket full of sand or water. You know what the thing you don't want to crash into is called? Like the pointy thing, whatever. That's called the Gore point. And it's not named after Al Gore. It's the Gore point. Yeah, it is named after what happens if you don't have the crash attenuation device. Get Gore. So why do I mention Pilot? Pilot, there's a story, right? So one of Pilot's devices, one of the things they make, is a sensor, an IoT device that attaches on the crash attenuation device. Because the thing about all crash attenuation devices, whatever the design, is that they are one use only. And after they've been crashed into, they need to be replaced. And absent a sensor, there's really only two ways that, for example, California Department of Caltrans or New York Department of Transportation, whoever, there's only two ways that they know that they've been damaged. One is if the person who crashes into it calls the police, or somebody calls the police and says there's been a crash. Right. And the police then bother to call the Department of Transportation and say somebody crashed into your crash attenuation device, then they'll hear about it. But lots of crashes, people can drive away under their own power. Police are not called. Right. And even if the police are called, they've got bigger fish to fry. They're like not on their short list to call the DOT. So what's the backstop to that? The backstop is that you send some dude in a truck to drive down the road with like a guy in the passenger seat, like looking at all the crash attenuation devices and noting if they've been damaged. And I don't know these people, and I hope I'm not slandering anybody, but it feels like it's a job for like a stoned 22-year-old. And the quality of the work that they get is probably what you would expect to get from a stoned 22-year-old. Certainly, there are plenty of crash attenuation devices out in the world that are not in the shape they should be in. And that's a risk. I've been following this company, Pilot, that makes the sensors. They make other things besides these sensors, but the sensor becomes a story because of a particular crash in California in 2018. There was a developer at Apple who was driving home from work in his Tesla. Stop me if you see where this is going. He put the Tesla in self-driving mode, and he started to play a game on his phone. The forensic work that was done subsequent to the inevitable and horrible crash was so detailed that we even know the game that this guy was playing on his phone as the Tesla accelerated to 75 miles an hour right into a gore point. The crash attenuation device there was not functioning because 11 days earlier, a guy in a Prius had crashed into it and limped away under his own power, and it hadn't gotten repaired. So this guy was killed. And his wife, totally reasonably, sued Tesla and sued the state of California as well for $11 kajillion. She wanted all the money in the world, and she deserved to get paid. Ultimately, I think everybody settled with her. But it wasn't cheap, I'm sure, and it put everyone on notice. There is technology in the world that could have prevented this. The technology is cheap. Failing to buy the technology is expensive. And I said, I want to invest in the company that makes this technology. There's a story, right? There's a story behind the team. There's a story behind every one of the products that they make and how they get used and the lives that they've saved. I really like the stories.
I mean, it's a great story. The notion of like story-driven investing just seems like a really, again, I'm going to go to the word satisfying way to exist, right? You get to build things. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about many of our conversations is you always come, when we go for our lunches, you always have these fun stories of these startups you're researching. And one thing about Michael, everybody, is that he finds these companies like Pilot, like others, that just seem so, it's not like, a SaaS marketplace for blah, 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 blah. It's always these really interesting things. And so, Michael, would you say because of the story-driven thesis, you're finding these not necessarily beaten path kind of companies?
It doesn't affect what I find necessarily, but it definitely affects the screening process. Some companies, they might be good, but you don't want to focus on them because they're boring. And so you move on to the ones that are interesting. You still invest in only a tiny fraction of them, but you focus on the ones that are interesting to you.
So, Michael, when you look at what you're doing now, how do you define success in what you're doing for yourself? I don't mean for the company or for the outside world, but for you, what is that thing that makes you feel like job well done?
You got to do work that you're proud of. Right? Got to do work where you can describe it to people and not feel like you're apologizing. That's important for me. And that is very much the case with the work that I'm doing today.
I think that's wonderful. If you could, and this is a little question I'd like to, if you could go back in time and slip younger Michael any kind of words of wisdom, not like go buy Bitcoin or whatever, but like think about the world this way, and not with the intent of sliding doors moments, but just like a bit of wisdom you've learned along the way, maybe from yourself, maybe from others. Is there something that has changed as you've aged that you would have maybe directed a little earlier?
There's a piece of advice that a coach gave me. I raced bicycles in college. We had a very, very good coach, a guy named John Alice. And there was something that John Alice said about cycling, that only when I was older did I come to appreciate it wasn't really about cycling. It was about life. And I wish that I had made that realization sooner and had applied it to more things in my life sooner. And it had to do especially with when you were racing somebody uphill, and it hurt a lot, really, really hurt. And John Alice's advice in that case is that's when you try harder, because the people you're racing against, they're hurting too, and they don't know how much you're hurting. And if you make it look easy, if you make it look like you're not suffering, some of them are going to give up.
Interesting.
That advice, that when it's not fun, that when it hurts, you try harder, you do more of that thing, and you don't complain about it, right? You make it look easy. I wish I'd learned that a few years earlier.
That is an absolutely great one. I love it. Michael, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Is there anything you want to plug? Any organization? Could be what you're doing, could be a nonprofit, could be anything in your life that you want to just say, hey, everybody go check this out?
So two things. The first is I have been for many, many years a supporter of a group of international schools called the United World Colleges. So anybody who's listening to this anywhere in the world, it's now a group of 18 schools around the world. Kids from over 100 countries attend. So
Amazing.
If you're a parent, consider it for your kids. If you are a high school aged kid, consider going. And if you are a donor to education related causes, check them out. They're great schools. Second thing, and this is much more specifically for people living in London or visiting London, I do sometimes invest in theater, and I have a show that just opened in the West End. It is the West End production of a show that was successful here in New York. So I would say buy lots of tickets, and the most expensive tickets you can get to see Stereophonic.
Stereophonic in the West End of London.
Yes.
Michael, thank you again. It's great to have you on the Founder at 50 podcast, and have a wonderful weekend. We're recording this on a Friday. Why not? I don't know what day we're publishing, but we're recording on a Friday. So you and everybody out there, I hope you have a lovely weekend.
Always great talking with you, Jeremy. Take care.
Thanks.